All righty, Panthers. So today we're going to talk about the robber barons or the captains of industry. Both of the terms were coined, they were invented, kind of first used by Teddy Roosevelt, who we'll talk about later on. Teddy Roosevelt is such a wackadoo, crazy, interesting figure that we'll talk about later on. But he used the term to describe this exact same people. Sometimes when he was talking to an audience, he would call them robber barons. Sometimes when he was talking to a different audience, he would call them captains of industry. Um, Obviously, they both carry different connotations and different meanings, right? The robber barons sounds like they're bad guys. And they were bad guys. These guys made a lot of money, and these guys became fabulously wealthy, wealthy beyond anyone's dreams. If these guys were around today, especially the last couple of ones that we'll talk about, if they were still around today, they would make Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg just look like common everyday millionaires. They couldn't be in the same category of rich as these guys. They were just incredibly rich, but they got there often by illegal or immoral means. They abused their workers. They took advantage of their workers. They were would bribe people. They would bribe judges to rule in lawsuits their way. They were just not very savory people. And then, if Teddy Roosevelt was talking to a different group of people, investors or rich people, he would call them captains of industry because they were. These guys came in at the end of, began coming in at the end of Reconstruction, when the United States really was kind of a backwater, third rate economic power. And these guys come in and single handedly, in a very, very short period of time, are going to turn the United States into an economic powerhouse, the likes of which the world had never seen before. And today, the economy in the United States, did you know today, in large part happens because of these guys. So, once again, going back to what we were talking about, sourcing, right? Language changes based on who your audience is. What you say and how you say it changes based on your audience. And this is a prime example. If you're talking to people who don't like these people, if you're talking to an audience that's not in favor of these people, you would call them robber barons. If you're talking to a bunch of rich people who like these guys, you would call them captains of industry. Are they good? Are they bad? Eh, they're kind of both. All right, vertical integration. This is how a lot of these guys made their money, was through this new process known as vertical integration. And here's what it looks like. It's when an industry owns all of the pieces of production from making for making their good, from the harvesting of the raw materials, the stuff that they need to make their product, to the manufacturing of this product, to the final sale of this product. They own and control every piece of that. And that's called vertical integration. So they can control all of the costs involved in creating and shipping and selling their product. They control all of that cost, and all of the money then comes to them. They don't have to pay middlemen for shipping or for production or for getting the materials that they need, because they have it all. So this is vertical integration. So this is what it would look like. Let's say we own a paper company, Pomona Paper Incorporated. And so we own the land. PPI owns the land that we're going to forest, that we're going to use for logging. So we own huge tracts of land where we cut down the trees that are eventually going to be used to turn this wood into paper. We then own the railroad that's going to take the logs to the factory for processing. We own the factory that's going to take these logs and turn it into paper. Again, we own the railroad that's going to now take that final product, paper, from the factory to the store. And then we're going to own the store that's going to sell the paper. And in addition to selling paper, we're going to sell other things in our store to get people to come in and buy from us. That's vertical integration. From the very beginning, right here, we own that. To the very end, we own that. And everything in between, we own everything. So we can control all the cost and all of the money stays with us. And that's how these guys make a lot of money. All right, so let's talk about some of these guys. The first two guys we're going to talk about are kind of lesser um, robber barons. They're the poorer robber barons. First guy we're going to talk about is Jay Gould. Jay Gould, what he would do is he would buy all these smaller railroads. So railroads have go from, let's say Philadelphia to Baltimore, or from Baltimore to Richmond, Virginia, just these very small railroads. And he would buy them and combine them into one large railroad company. He also, at one point, tried to buy all of the gold available in the United States so he could control the gold market. And the reason he wanted to do that is because at this time, the United States was on the money in the United States was on what was called the gold standard, meaning for every dollar that the United States government printed every year, the United States government had to have a dollar's worth of gold to back it up. And it would say on the dollar bill, gold certificate. So you could literally go into the bank and you could exchange your paper dollar for a dollar's worth of gold. So at this time, Jay Gould thought if he could own and control all of the gold in the country, then he could control the economy. And he tried, right? Because if the government's going to make, let's say, $100, they've got to have $100 worth of gold to make that money. And if the government's going to make that money and Jay Gould owns all of the gold, they're going to have to buy the gold from Jay Gould. So he's going to control the economy. Now, he never gets close to doing this, but he tries. And that just shows you the amount of money that these guys had, that they would attempt to control the American economy by themselves. When he dies in 1892, he's worth $74 million. That's in 1892. $74 million is a lot of money today. Imagine what it was like in 1892. Woof! That's crazy money. All right, next guy, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Good old Corny. So Cornelius Vanderbilt, he lives in Nashville, and he starts making his money. He first makes his money in shipping when steamships first came along. And he bought a bunch of steamships, and he would ship products up and down the Mississippi River from New Orleans up to Nashville, and then back, and so on and so forth. So that's where he makes his money, is in shipping on steamships. And then when railroads come along, then he just transfers his shipping business from steamships to railroads, because railroads, unlike steamships, can go wherever there's tracks. Steamships can only go wherever there's water, right? So there was more opportunities in railroads. Uh, Good old Corny would battle Jay Gould, the guy we talked about before, to buy railroads. He did the same thing that Gould did. He would buy up these smaller railroads and combine them into one larger railroad and go from there. Now, the one who won these lawsuits, they would go to court and they would sue each other. The one who won these lawsuits was whoever bribed the judge the most money, and then the judge would find in their favor. The average bribe that these guys paid out to judges was $15,000 just to get the judge to rule in their favor. $15,000. Now, this is in a time when most Americans are barely making $1,000 a year. And you need about $1,000 a year just to survive in the United States. And that's about what most people were making. They're paying $15,000 to judges. And they're not even thinking about it. It's like taking a dollar bill out and giving it to somebody. He turns the New York Central into the largest railroad in the United States. And he's known for his parties, right? If you wanted to be invited to Cornelius Vanderbilt's parties, and here's why: because when you arrived, he would give you a crystal glass, and there would be like a horse trough, like a big metal container where horses would drink out of. And that horse trough would be filled with sand, and there would be this contraption like a shovel. Like if you go to King Stupid's and you use the claw to pull out, to pull out stuffed animals out of the big box there in the claw at King Stupid's, and you spend like $15 to win a $3 teddy bear or whatever. So it was that kind of contraption, and you would dig through the sand and you would pour the sand into your glass. And whatever you dug up, you got to keep. Well, what he had buried in the sand that he was giving away were diamonds and rubies and emeralds and gold and silver, pearls, just the precious jewels and precious metals. He was just giving away as a thank you for coming to your party. That's a lot better than like, remember when you were 6 years old and you would go to your best friend's birthday party and you get a plastic bag with some plastic toys in it, right? You remember that? Yeah, good old Corny. Also, Cornelius Vanderbilt, if you've ever heard of Vanderbilt University, it's known as the Harvard of the South. It's in Nashville. He's the one that starts it. And that's why it's called Vanderbilt University, because he's the one that starts it. Just to show you how rich these guys are, I'm going to show you Cornelius Vanderbilt's vacation house, right? Now, this is a house that he went to maybe on the weekends, maybe a couple of weeks out of the summer. This is not his normal, regular house, right? So vacation houses usually are not as nice as your regular house because you're only there part of the time. So this is Cornelius Vanderbilt's vacation house, okay? It's called the Breakers. Now, just keep in mind, this is not as nice as his regular house. There's the outside. So let's go on inside. The sitting room. So this is like the room, in the front of your house. Um, well, it would be like your family room where you watch TV. This is where you'd hang out. That's the sitting room. The music room. He would have these huge parties. He would bring in an entire orchestra for the party. And they would all go to the music room. Now, all of this yellow that you can kind of see on the walls and on the ceiling, that's all gold that he has. There's hand carved ceilings and walls. So there were craftsmen who hand carved out these designs, and then they took gold and applied it to the walls and ceilings. So that's all gold. Hokey smoky. The formal reception room. So this is the room in the front of your house, like where your parents have all the nice furniture, and you don't know why because nobody ever sits there, right? You never use that room. So this is the formal reception room. And again, all of this gold here, all this yellow, that's all gold. Those are gold. Those are table legs that are covered with gold. And the mirror up here, that's all gold. And this is his vacation house, y'all. Holy cow. All right, let's talk about some of the big guys. Andrew Carnegie. Sometimes it's called Carnegie. Carnegie, I think, is the proper pronunciation. He's from Scotland. That's how they would say it in Scotland. Carnegie is the Americanized version. So he comes from Scotland in 1848 when he's 12 years old. He immigrates here as a 12-year-old. His first job was as a machine wiper. And it's exactly what it sounds like. So they had these factories with these machines going, and they never shut down the machines. The machines were constantly working and making stuff. Because if they shut them down, then they weren't making stuff. And if they weren't making stuff, they're not making money. So these machines are working all the time. But they would build up this gunk and like oil and stuff like that would build up on the gears and on the mechanisms of the machinery. So you'd literally have to go in and wipe that stuff off so it didn't gum up the gears and the machinery and break it. But you would do this while the machine was working. So very often they would hire young kids to do this because kids were smaller, so they can get back into the machinery easier, and they could pay kids less. It was a very dangerous job doing this. It was not uncommon for kids to have fingers ripped off, arms ripped off, their bodies cut in half. And back then, because there weren't any laws about any of this, they would just go, well, that sucks for you, right? Your arm got torn off. Wow, that's pretty terrible. Good thing you've got two so you can keep on working. Huh. So that was his first job as a machine wiper, and he literally went into the machinery and wiped it down. For doing this, he got paid $1.12 a week. A week he got paid that. Holy cow, he's not even making $5 a month. Eventually, he becomes a telegraph operator with a railroad in Pittsburgh. And telegraph operators, that was a really, really good job. It was like computer programmers. They were high demand, but not a lot of people knew how to do it. Telegraph was the internet of its day. Everybody wanted to use the telegraph so you could very quickly send messages across the country. But very few people knew how to be a telegraph operator. Andrew Carnegie taught himself, and he got hired to run a telegraph machine in a railroad depot. Very often, the telegraph stations, offices were in train depots. So he gets a job as a telegraph operator in Pittsburgh, which is where he lived, and he becomes very good friends with his supervisor, the guy in charge of the depot. They become very good friends, and his friend begins to get promoted in this railroad company. And as his friend gets promoted, he promotes Andrew Carnegie with him. Pretty soon, by the time he's 24 years old, Andrew Carnegie is in charge of the entire Western operations of this railroad company. 24! Imagine that. In 10 years, can you guys imagine yourselves being in charge of an entire region of the country for a major company? Whoa! So he's on his way, and he's making really good money. By the time he's 25, he's pretty rich. He's one of the wealthiest people in the United States. And then he goes on a trip to England. While he's on a trip in England, he goes on a tour, and everything for him and for the country is about to change. While in England, he goes on a tour of a steel factory, and they're making a new type of steel called Bessemer steel. Bessemer steel is different than the steel that's being made in the United States. It's cheaper to make, it's lighter than the steel used here, and it's more durable. So it's cheaper, it's easier to transport and maneuver, and it's more durable. It lasts longer. And Andrew Carnegie sees this process, and he goes, hey, bing, I got an idea. If I can bring this process back to the United States and make this new type of steel, he said, I'm going to make $1 million. I'll become a millionaire. At this time in the United States, we're in this process of becoming industrialized, coming out of the Civil War, and we're rebuilding the country and becoming industrialized. So there's a really, really high demand for steel. We're building railroads. Railroads depend on steel. You need steel for the rails. You need steel for the trains. We're becoming industrialized. We're building more and more factories. These factories are being built out of steel. More and more buildings are being built out of steel. This country, the United States, is becoming more and more reliant and dependent on steel. And Carnegie says, if I can bring this back, it'll revolutionize the United States. So Carnegie comes home and he sells off everything he has. I mean, he is completely flat broke. He doesn't have a dime to his name to build a steel factory in the United States, creating Bessemer Steel. This is how much he believes in it, that he's absolutely flat broke right now. He calls this Carnegie Steel, later becomes known as U.S. Steel, and since he's from Pittsburgh, that's where he builds it. Wait a minute! Steel in Pittsburgh? Have you ever wondered why the Pittsburgh Steelers are called the Pittsburgh Steelers? This is why. because Pittsburgh becomes the steel capital of the United States. Oh, y'all, that's why history's cool. They name football teams after historical events, right? This is not, they don't call them the Pittsburgh Numerators. Nobody would be afraid of them. The Pittsburgh Fractions. Oh, nay, nay. Pittsburgh Steelers, because steel is what came from Pittsburgh. And the Steelers, they're spelled Steelers, not Steal. They don't steal the ball. They're Steelers. They're making steel. And the little logo think of the Pittsburgh Steelers logo on the side of their helmet, the three diamonds, the three different colored diamonds. That was the logo of U.S. Steel. And those diamonds represent the various elements used to create steel. Oh, that's why history's cool, y'all. Then Carnegie's going to do something different. There's lots of steel operations around the country, but they supply steel just for their region or their local area, right? Nobody's supplying steel across the country. Carnegie is going to begin to go across the country and sell his steel. In the process, he's going to put his competitors out of business. And eventually, he's going to take over the world in steel. So here's what he would do. He would go into these various areas and regions around the country, right? Say he goes to New York City and he finds out who the people are in New York City that are making steel for New York City, for the New York City area. And he figures out what they're charging for steel per ton. And then he's going to charge less for people to buy his steel. And eventually, obviously people are going to buy from him, and eventually he'll put his competitors out of business. So here's an example. Let's say to make 1 ton of steel, to make it and ship it and make a profit, it costs $3 to make and ship the steel. So you're going to sell it for around $6, $3 to pay for the making of the steel, and $3 profit, right, for a ton of steel. So Carnegie is going to sell his steel for $2.50 a ton. He's not even going to sell it for enough money to make up for the production of it, right? He's going to lose money making the steel. Well, obviously his competitors can't compete with that. He's selling better steel at a lower price, and he's losing money in the process. So eventually his competitors go out of business because nobody's buying from them. As soon as he's put all of his competitors out, he would jack up the price to $6, maybe $6.50 a ton. Now, all of these numbers are totally made up, right? Just to make it simple here. So he would jack up the prices once his competitors are out, and people would protest and go, "Wait a minute, I was just buying steel for you for $2.50 a ton." And Andrew Carnegie would say, "Well, sorry, you could go buy it somewhere else." Oh, that's right. There is nobody else to buy from. If you're buying steel, you'd be buying from me. By 1889, most of the steel in the United States comes from Carnegie Steel. About 95% of the steel being consumed in the United States by 1889 comes from his steel plant. By 1900, most of the steel in the world is coming from Carnegie Steel. So he's supplying almost all of the steel for the rest of the world. Carnegie Steel becomes the first billion-dollar company. It becomes the first company to make $1 billion. When he dies, Carnegie is worth $298 billion. That's in today's money. He's worth $300 billion in today's money. Now, here's the crazy thing. Andrew Carnegie eventually is going to sell off his steel company. And he's going to spend the rest of his life, about the last 10, 15, 20 years of his life, literally giving away his money. Just giving it away. He builds libraries because he thought it was important that people read and be educated. So he built libraries all over the country. He created a number of different charities, philanthropical societies. There's a very large society that's very involved in like PBS, a lot of educational programming called the Carnegie Foundation. That comes from him. Carnegie Hall. He was a lover of performing arts. He loved going to see plays and operas and so on and so forth. And so he built Carnegie Hall, this huge performing arts complex in New York City. He built it. So he spends the last 15 years of his life or so literally just giving away his money. And when he dies, he's still worth $300 billion. Woof. So here's one of my favorite stories. Okay. Over time, Carnegie gets tired of running a steel empire. He's got labor problems. Guys are going on strike, and he's just getting kind of worn out. So he talks about selling steel, right? If somebody's willing to pay him the price, he's willing to sell it. Now, how he sells it is a crazy story, and it's one of my favorite stories. And it involves this guy, J.P. Morgan. Quite the guy. So J.P. Morgan is a banker, and they happen to be at the same party. And J.P. Morgan he's looking to get involved in other things other than banking. And he's heard that Andrew Carnegie is looking to sell off his steel empire. So J.P. Morgan writes on a napkin, and he gives it to one of the waiters at the party. He says, "Would you go take this to Andrew Carnegie?" Andrew Carnegie, he takes it over to Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie reads it, and it says on the napkin, "Are you interested in selling Carnegie Steel?" J.P. Morgan. Andrew Carnegie writes back on the napkin, and he gives it back to the waiter. The waiter goes over, and they have this back and forth, this exchange between them on this napkin. And Andrew Carnegie ends up agreeing to sell his steel company to J.P. Morgan based off of a running conversation, like a text message on a napkin. Carnegie sells his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $492 million. But not in credit, not a check, not payments, $492 in cold, hard cash. When Andrew Carnegie goes to get paid, he goes to JP Morgan's house, he literally gets a suitcase filled with Benjamins. Holy smokes! And JP Morgan, as he hands him this suitcase full of money, he tells Andrew Carnegie, "How does it feel to be the richest man in the world?" And Andrew Carnegie was at that point. All right, so let's talk about JP Morgan. He owns a bank during the Civil War. He makes lots and lots of loans during the Civil War. And then as those loans get repaid following the Civil War, he becomes enormously wealthy. The bank that he starts, it's in New York City. And today, it's Chase Manhattan Bank. If you've heard of Chase Manhattan Bank, that's JP Morgan's bank. Pretty soon, he begins to branch out through making loans to businesses and acquiring businesses. And pretty soon, he's involved in pretty much everything that goes on in the United States. Right? There's very few business dealings that he's not somehow, some way involved in. In fact, Thomas Edison, he gets his money. J.P. Morgan is his financer. J.P. Morgan's the one that's paying for Thomas Edison's laboratory and his experiments. And J.P. Morgan actually has his house electrified. His house is the first house in the United States to have electricity running into it. People were terrified of electricity. They were convinced that if you had electricity running into your house would burst into flames and it would burn down and just light. They were afraid that electricity would jump out of the walls and electrocute you and everything. And J.P. Morgan had his house electrified. He had electric lights and electricity run into his house as a favor to Thomas Edison to show that electricity was safe. Pretty soon, Morgan begins buying up all the railroads. Okay, He begins buying out all these railroads across the country, which is why he wants steel. Remember, we talked about vertical integration? He wants the steel because he needs steel to build these railroads and to maintain the railroads, which is why he buys the steel company. By 1900, Morgan owns almost half of the railroads in the United States. By the time he dies in 1913, he owns about 90% of the railroads in the United States. He controls almost all of the railroads in the United States. When he dies, Morgan's worth $39 billion. That was in money back then. If you adjusted it to today's money, he's worth over $300 billion. In fact, at one point, JP Morgan was very concerned about the national debt of the United States. He was worried the United States owed too much money and it was going to become a problem for the United States. It was going to cause economic problems because the United States owed too much money. So JP Morgan literally wrote a check, a personal check, and paid off the United States debt. Woof. All right, next guy, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, he gets involved in oil. And he's 32 years old, and he starts an oil company in Cleveland called Standard Oil. Okay. And like Carnegie, Rockefeller, he starts this oil company, and he would, there's all these regional, smaller oil companies that just sell oil to to the immediate region. He would go and buy them out and force them out of business, like Carnegie did, undercut their prices, force them out of business, and he would jack up his prices. Now, oil, when it comes along in the 1870s, here's why it's a big deal. Okay. We never really knew what to do with oil. We knew it was there, certainly, but we didn't know what to do with it. And eventually, somebody figures out that if you take this crude oil, this black goo coming out of the ground, and you do process it, if you process it, you get something out of oil called kerosene. And kerosene was amazing in the 1870s because prior to this, most of the heating and most of the not most of the heating, but most of the light that was being used came from whale oil. Whale oil would be put into lamps, and it was used to make candles for lighting. And the problem was whales were about to be extinct. Whaling was a huge industry in the mid 1800s, early 1800s. Whaling was a monstrous industry for the whale oil. They would kill the whale. They would just cut off the blubber of the whale, and then they would boil it, and you would get this oil that come up out of the blubber. And then that's what they would use to make candles and lamps and so on and so forth. The problem was whales by late 1860s, 1870s, whales were about extinct. And people were terrified. Oh my God, if we run out of whales, we're not going to have any more light. We're going to go back to living in the dark ages and so on and so forth. And then somebody figures out, well, we can use this black goo that comes out of the ground and do this process, and we make kerosene out of it. Kerosene burned brighter. Kerosene burned hotter. Kerosene burned cleaner. Whale oil smelled pretty bad. So you didn't get that whale oil smell out of kerosene. And so kerosene becomes this huge environmental savior. Oil, ironically enough, saved the whales. By 1879, Rockefeller owns and controls 90% of the oil in the United States. So if you're buying oil, you're buying it from Rockefeller. And then Rockefeller, because these guys knew each other, Rockefeller and JP Morgan, who owns all the railroads, they make a deal where J.D. Rockefeller can ship his oil really cheap on Morgan's trains, and Morgan would make up the difference in cost by charging Rockefeller's competitors more money. And then they would split the extra money amongst themselves. So just insane, crazy way to make money and really to take advantage of people. And one more thing about the kerosene. Kerosene when they were making kerosene, they had this weird byproduct that kind of smelled, and they didn't know what to do with it. So they would dump it into sewers and down gutters and into creeks and stuff because they didn't know what to do with this leftover stuff when they were processing crude oil into kerosene. Turns out this byproduct that they were creating was gasoline. And for a long time, before they had gasoline engines and cars and stuff, they were just dumping the gasoline into the waterways. Huh. All right. So here's what Rockefeller begins to do. He begins to open up grocery stores, right? To sell his kerosene. But in addition to just selling kerosene, he would sell meat and sugar and flour and lumber, things like that. So when people would come into town, right? Coming into town was a big event when you came into town. When people would come into town, it was usually a monthly trip. And you would have to make several different stops. You'd go to the hardware store, you'd go to the lumber store, you'd go to the general store, you'd go to the kerosene store, and you'd buy all these things that you need. So Rockefeller just decides, I'm going to open up a store, I'm going to sell kerosene, but in addition to that, I'm going to sell everything else that people need. So instead of having to go to 4, 5, 6, 7 different places, they'll just go to one place and they'll get it all from me. Huh. And you can see the advertisement here. This is for a gas station. You can go in and get your gas. While you're there, pick up some plates. Rockefeller also would hire detectives to figure out who wasn't buying kerosene from him. And then these detectives would go out and visit these people and strongly encourage them that they should buy their kerosene from Standard Oil. You really like both your knees? Well, if you want to keep them, I think I'd buy some oil, some kerosene from Standard Oil. Mm-hmm. By 1892, Rockefeller's worth $800 million. Today's money, that would be 300 billion. Oh, and crazy, crazy money these guys are dealing with. Just insane money these guys are dealing with. Rockefeller and Carnegie did not like each other, and they competed with each other. And when Carnegie begins giving away his money, Rockefeller begins giving away his money so Rockefeller or Carnegie doesn't get all the glory. Rockefeller Center in New York City, built by John Rockefeller. Rockefeller creates some philanthropical charity foundations to compete with Carnegie because they hated each other and they competed with each other who was going to be the richest and who was going to be the wealthiest and who was going to be the most loved and so on and so forth. So there you go. The robber barons. Were they good? Yeah, I guess. Were they bad? Yeah, absolutely. And later on, we'll talk about the workers, and you'll find out why they were so bad. So there's the notes. Make sure you took the notes on the virtual note template that I showed you guys. Make sure you take those notes on. You've taken these notes on there, and fill out all of the parts of that note template that I went over with you guys, and then share the notes with me so I know that you took them. We'll see you next time.